What if every financial struggle you've ever faced, the inflation eating your paycheck, the mortgage you'll spend 30 years paying off, the credit card debt that somehow never disappears was engineered by design over a century ago, December 23, 1913. Most of Congress had already left Washington for Christmas. In a nearly empty chamber, a handful of senators passed the Federal Reserve Act, the bill that would change American finance forever. They told you it was about preventing bank panics, about stabilizing the economy, about protecting your savings. They lied. Here's what they didn't tell you: the Federal Reserve isn't federal, and there are no reserves. It's a private banking cartel with a government mask. Given the legal power to create money from nothing, loan it to your government at interest, and trap every generation of Americans in permanent, unpayable debt. And the mechanism they buried in that bill, it's the reason you're working harder than your parents but can afford less. It's why a house that cost $20,000 in 1970 now costs $400,000. It's why the national debt is $34 trillion and climbing every second. This isn't inflation, this isn't bad policy. This is the Federal Reserve working exactly as it was designed, extracting wealth from your labor and funneling it upward to a banking elite you'll never see. But here's what makes this truly sinister. The system they created doesn't just take your money. It makes it mathematically impossible for the debt to ever be repaid. Every dollar created comes with interest that doesn't exist. It's a trap with no exit. Before we go deeper, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Let's build a global community of people who refuse to accept the official story. And if you want the unfiltered truth about the financial systems designed to keep you enslaved, hit subscribe. This isn't mainstream media, this is the history they buried. Let's unbury it. The official story starts with the panic of 1907, a financial crisis, bank runs, market collapse. J.P. Morgan himself had to step in, using his personal fortune to prevent total economic meltdown. The narrative they fed the public: America needs a central bank to prevent this chaos. We need stability. We need expert management of the money supply. But here's what actually happened. November 1910, Jekyll Island, Georgia, a private island resort closed to the public. 7 men arrived in secret, using only first names to avoid recognition. They came in a private railway car, traveling under the cover of darkness. Who were they? Senator Nelson Aldrich, the most powerful Republican in Congress and father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller Jr., Frank Vanderlip from National City Bank, Henry Davison from J.P. Morgan, Charles Norton from First National Bank, and Paul Warburg representing the Rothschild banking interests through Kahn, Loeb & Co. These weren't public servants. They were the money masters of America. And for 10 days, they drafted the blueprint for the Federal Reserve System. Their goal wasn't stability, it was control. They designed a system that would look like a government institution but operate as a private banking cartel. A system where private banks would own the Federal Reserve, control its operations, and profit from its activities, all while appearing to serve the public interest. Sound familiar? Think about 2008, the financial crisis that destroyed millions of American families who got bailed out. The banks, Goldman Sachs received $10 billion. Bank of America got $45 billion. Citigroup took $45 billion, all of it backed by the Federal Reserve and taxpayer guarantees. And who went to prison? Nobody. Not one banking executive was prosecuted. They kept their bonuses. They kept their jobs. You kept the bill. That's not a failure of the system. That's the system functioning perfectly, exactly as the Jekyll Island conspirators designed it. Let's go deeper into 1913. The Federal Reserve Act was introduced to Congress with deceptive framing. It was called the Federal Reserve to make it sound like a government agency. But it's not. It's a network of 12 private regional banks owned by member banks, the very institutions it's supposed to regulate. The act gave this private cartel 3 revolutionary powers. First, the exclusive right to print U.S. currency, not gold certificates, not treasury notes, Federal Reserve notes, which are debt instruments, not money. Every dollar created is a dollar borrowed. Second, the power to set interest rates, controlling the cost of money for the entire economy. This determines whether you can afford a mortgage, whether businesses can expand, whether the stock market booms or crashes. Third, the authority to buy government bonds, effectively giving the Fed the power to finance government spending by creating money from nothing. Now here's the kicker: when the government needs money, it issues treasury bonds. The Fed creates money, literally entries in a computer, and purchases those bonds. The government gets cash to spend, but it owes the Fed the principal plus interest. Where does the government get money to pay the interest? From you. Through taxes. Sound familiar? In 2023, the U.S. government paid $659 billion just in interest on the national debt. That's more than the entire defense budget. more than education, infrastructure, and healthcare combined. $659 billion, not for services, not for programs, just interest payments on money that was created out of thin air. You're not funding roads and schools. You're funding payments to bondholders and banks. But it gets darker. The same year the Federal Reserve Act passed, another amendment quietly slipped through the 16th Amendment, establishing federal income tax. Coincidence? No, coordination. Before 1913, the federal government had no permanent income tax. It funded itself through tariffs and excise taxes. But the Federal Reserve System required a guaranteed revenue stream to service the debt it would create. Income tax was the enforcement mechanism. It ensured the government could always make interest payments, no matter how large the debt grew. Sound familiar? Today, roughly 40% of federal income tax revenue goes directly to servicing the national debt. You're not paying for government services. You're paying interest to the Federal Reserve and the bondholders it represents. You work January, February, March, and half of April just to cover interest on debt created by a private banking cartel. Now let's talk about fractional reserve banking, the engine that powers this system. When you deposit $100 in your bank, the bank only keeps a fraction in reserve, historically around 10%. But as of 2020, the reserve requirement is zero. The rest gets loaned out. That loaned money gets deposited in another bank, which loans it out again. Through this process, your 1,000 becomes 10,000 in the money supply, except none of that money exists. It's all debt, it's numbers and computers, and every dollar of it carries an interest obligation. This is why housing prices explode, why student debt is unpayable, why credit cards trap millions in endless minimum payments. The system creates infinite debt with finite money to repay it. Sound familiar? You're not failing to get ahead. The game is rigged so you can't. Now here's the twist most people never learn. The Federal Reserve wasn't just about controlling America's money. It was about controlling America's government. Because once you control the money supply, you control policy, you control wars, you control elections, you control everything. And the man who understood this better than anyone, the architect of the entire system, was Paul Warburg. Paul Warburg was a German banker, born into one of Europe's most powerful financial dynasties. He arrived in America in 1902 and quickly became a partner at Kuhn, Loeb & Co., the investment bank representing Rothschild interests in the United States. At Jekyll Island, Warburg was the mastermind. He drafted the technical structure of the Federal Reserve, modeling it directly on European central banks, particularly the Reichsbank and the Bank of England. Why does that matter? Because European central banks had already perfected the formula of private ownership disguised as public service, government dependence through debt monetization, and most importantly, the ability to finance wars without raising taxes. Warburg knew that a central bank with money creation power could fund unlimited government spending. Politicians could fight wars, expand programs, and buy votes, all by borrowing money that didn't exist. The cost would be hidden in inflation, silently taxing every citizen by erasing the value of their savings. This is the devil's bargain embedded in the Federal Reserve. The government gets infinite spending capacity. The banks get infinite profit through interest on debt, and the people get permanent inflation and servitude. But here's where it gets absolutely wild. Paul Warburg had a brother, Max Warburg, and during World War I, while Paul sat on the Federal Reserve Board directing America's financial policy, his brother Max was running Germany's intelligence operations and advising Kaiser Wilhelm on war finance. Two brothers, two central banks, two nations at war, funding both sides. This wasn't about patriotism, it was about profit. Because war is the most lucrative business in human history, and central banks are the institutions that make war affordable for governments. When World War I erupted in 1942, just months after the Fed was created, the U.S. officially remained neutral. But the Federal Reserve immediately began financing Britain and France by purchasing their war bonds. By 1917, American banks had loaned $2.3 billion to the Allies. If Germany won, those loans would default. So America entered the war not to save democracy, but to protect Wall Street's balance sheets. The Federal Reserve made it possible. And this pattern, using central bank money creation to finance wars that profit the banking elite, has repeated in every major conflict since. But there's one more piece. One more name that connects 1913 to the greatest financial catastrophe in history. You won't believe the name. The receipt is wilder than you think. Let's break down exactly how the Federal Reserve's debt monetization system works, because once you see the mechanics, you'll understand why escape is impossible. Step 1, Congress passes a spending bill. It doesn't matter what for: military, healthcare infrastructure. The Treasury needs to raise funds. Step 2, the Treasury issues bonds. These are IOUs, promises to repay the money plus interest over time. These bonds are auctioned to banks, foreign governments, and investors. Step 3, if there aren't enough buyers, or if the Fed wants to inject money into the economy, it purchases Treasury bonds itself. Here's the magic trick sheet. The Federal Reserve doesn't have this money, it creates it. The Fed opens its computer system and credits the Treasury's account with digital dollars. No gold, no reserves, no actual wealth, just keystrokes. The government now has money to spend. It enters the economy through government contracts, salaries, and programs. But the Treasury owes the Federal Reserve the face value of those bonds plus interest. Here's the fatal flaw built into the system. The Fed creates the principal but not the interest. Let's use simple numbers. The Fed creates $1,000 and loans it to the government at 5% interest. The government now owes ones or 50, but only $1,000 exists in the money supply. The extra 50 doesn't exist. Where does it come from? From more borrowing. The government must issue more bonds to pay the interest on the old bonds. This creates new debt, which requires new interest payments, which requires new borrowing. It's a perpetual debt spiral by design. The system mathematically guarantees the debt can never be repaid. And who profits? The bondholders, the banks. The Federal Reserve member institutions that receive dividends from Fed profits. In 2022 alone, the Federal Reserve paid $3.3 billion in dividends to member banks. That's your money, extracted through a system designed to trap your government, and by extension, you in permanent debt. Now let's talk about how the Fed uses interest rates as a weapon of control. When the Fed raises interest rates, borrowing becomes expensive, mortgages cost more, business loans dry up, the economy slows, unemployment rises. When the Fed lowers rates, borrowing becomes cheap, asset prices inflate, the stock market soars. But wages don't keep pace, so real wealth concentrates among those who own assets, the rich. The Fed claims it's managing inflation and employment, but what it's really doing is engineering boom-bust cycles that allow the financial elite to buy assets cheap during crashes and sell high during booms. Let me give you the numbers. In 2008, after the housing crash, the Fed dropped interest rates to near zero and created $3.7 trillion through quantitative easing. The stock market tripled over the next decade. Billionaire wealth increased by 80%. Meanwhile, homeownership rates fell to their lowest level since 1965 and wages stagnated. Then in 2020, during the pandemic, the Fed created another $4.8 trillion. Billionaires gained $5 trillion in wealth in just 2 years. 40 million Americans filed for unemployment. This isn't coincidence. This is engineered wealth transfer. Here's the cruelest part. Every time the Fed creates money, it devalues every dollar you've saved. Inflation is not a natural phenomenon, it's a policy choice. When the Fed expands the money supply faster than the economy produces goods and services, each dollar buys less. Your savings lose value. Your paycheck buys less. You get poorer without losing a single dollar from your account. Since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, the US dollar has lost 97% of its purchasing power. Let me repeat that. 97%. A dollar in 1913 could buy what 930 buys today. Your great-grandparents could purchase a house for $5,000, and today the median home price is $400,000, not because houses improved, but because the dollar was systematically destroyed. This is theft, legal, institutional, invisible theft, and it's baked into the Federal Reserve's DNA. Now let's talk about moral hazard, the principle that drove the 2008 collapse and the 2020 crisis. Moral hazard occurs when someone takes risks because they know they won't face consequences. In the financial system, this happens because banks know the Federal Reserve will bail them out. In 2008, banks made reckless loans, bundled them into toxic securities, and sold them as safe investments. When the housing bubble burst, those securities became worthless. Banks faced insolvency. The Fed's response: it purchased $1.25 trillion in mortgage-backed securities, the very toxic assets that caused the crisis. It gave banks emergency loans at 0.01% interest rates. It guaranteed their survival. And the executives who created the disaster, they kept their jobs, they kept their bonuses. Some got raises. Meanwhile, 10 million Americans lost their homes. $16 trillion in household wealth evaporated. Unemployment hit 10%. The losses were socialized. The profits remained private. This is the parasitic finance model the Jekyll Island conspirators created. But here's the number that should infuriate you during the 2008 crisis. The Fed secretly loaned $16 trillion to banks around the world. Not just American banks, Deutsche Bank, Credit Suisse, Barclays, UBS, Royal Bank of Scotland. We only found out because Senator Bernie Sanders forced a partial audit in 2011. $16 trillion, more than the entire US GDP loaned in secret, without congressional approval, without public knowledge. The Federal Reserve was using American money to bail out the global banking cartel. And you had no say in it. Today, the system has evolved into something even more dangerous. The total value of assets it holds stood at $870 billion in 2007. By 2022, it had exploded to $8.9 trillion. That's a 923% increase. Nearly $9 trillion created from nothing and used to purchase government bonds and mortgage-backed securities. Who benefits? The financial institutions that sell those assets to the Fed at inflated prices. The wealthy who own stocks and real estate that the Fed's policies inflate. Who loses? You, through inflation, through stagnant wages, through unaffordable housing. But it gets worse. The Fed is now openly discussing a central bank digital currency, a digital dollar that would give the Federal Reserve direct control over every transaction you make. Think about what that means. No cash, no privacy, every purchase tracked, the ability to freeze accounts remotely, the power to impose negative interest rates, automatically deducting money from your savings, the capability to program money, allowing the government to control what you can buy, where you can spend, and when your money expires. This is the ultimate evolution of the 1913 conspiracy. Total financial surveillance and control, and it's being sold as convenience and innovation. Finally, let's talk about what happens next. The Fed's playbook is simple: create crisis through reckless policy, expand power by solving the crisis with more money creation, consolidate control. Repeat, every crash makes the Fed more powerful. Every bailout makes banks more reckless. Every round of money printing makes you poorer. And the math is undeniable: the system is approaching collapse. The national debt is $34 trillion and growing by $1 trillion every 100 days. Interest payments alone will exceed $1.6 trillion annually by 2033. That's half of all federal tax revenue. When interest payments consume the entire federal budget, there are only three options. 1, default on the debt and collapse the global financial system. 2, raise taxes to confiscatory levels and trigger economic depression. 3, print more money, accelerate inflation, and destroy the currency. The Fed will choose option 3 because it protects the banks, preserves the system, and allows the wealth extraction to continue until the dollar becomes worthless. This is the engineered collapse, the controlled demolition. The endgame that was set in motion on Jekyll Island in 1910 and codified into law in 1913. And unless you understand the mechanism, you can't prepare for what's coming. So here we are, living inside the greatest financial experiment in human history, a system built on debt that can never be repaid, currency backed by nothing but faith, institutions designed to extract your wealth under the illusion of stability. The Federal Reserve has survived for 111 years not because it works for you, but because it works perfectly for those who created it. But here's the truth they don't want you to accept. Systems built on borrowed time always collapse, and the next collapse will dwarf everything you've seen, because the debt is bigger now, the money printing faster, the moral hazard deeper, the interconnections between central banks, governments, and financial institutions so entangled that when one fails, the entire structure comes down. The Fed created $3 trillion in 2008 and called it an emergency. They created $4.8 trillion in 2020 and called it necessary. What happens next time when the debt is $50 trillion, when inflation is 20%? When confidence in the dollar finally breaks? There's no bailout big enough, no amount of money printing that can restore trust once it's shattered. And that's the real secret they buried in 1900. The Federal Reserve was never meant to prevent collapse. It was designed to extract maximum wealth before the inevitable crash, and to ensure the bankers who designed it would own the wreckage. This is why denial is so dangerous. People don't want to believe the system is rigged. They don't want to believe their government sold them out a century ago. They don't want to believe the institutions they trust were engineered to exploit them. So they ignore the warnings. They trust the experts. They keep working, keep borrowing, keep playing a game where the rules guarantee they lose. But you don't have to. Now you see the architecture. You understand the mechanism. You know the pattern. So what are you going to do? Drop a comment and tell me, are we wiser now, or are we walking the same path in better suits? If this video opened your eyes, hit that subscribe button. Share this everywhere. Because the only way we break the cycle is by refusing to stay blind. The Federal Reserve secret isn't buried anymore. The question is, will you act on it?